The lights were low, the air thick with anticipation, and every eye in the packed auditorium followed the figure striding confidently toward the podium. Bill Clinton, the former president whose name once symbolized power and persuasion, leaned into the microphone with a practiced grin. His voice carried the easy charm of a seasoned politician, but beneath that charm, something sharper lurked. He paused, scanning the audience with that trademark smirk, then let his words cut through the silence. "You know, it's one thing to claim you've had a legal career," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "but it's another thing to actually make a difference in one." A ripple of gasps spread instantly through the crowd. People exchanged stunned glances, whispering in disbelief. Was he really questioning Jasmine Crockett's right to call herself an accomplished attorney? Was the former president stooping so low as to dismiss the years she spent fighting for clients who couldn't afford anyone else? Clinton leaned back, satisfied with the sting of his words, as though expecting polite laughter or muted applause. Instead, the room shifted uneasily. The arrogance in his jab was impossible to miss. He wasn't just attacking a record. He was attempting to diminish a woman who had carved her place in the world with grit and unshakable determination. For Crockett, sitting just a few feet away, the insult landed like a challenge, not a wound. Her expression remained calm, her posture unbroken, but inside the tension simmered. The crowd could sense it too, that quiet storm building beneath the surface. The contrast was stark. The old guard's arrogance, standing against the quiet dignity of someone who had clawed her way up against every odd. Cameras flashed, capturing Clinton's smirk, the uneasy shifting in the audience and Crockett's stillness. It was the stillness of someone who knew the weight of the moment. The silence that followed was heavy, suspenseful, almost cinematic, and then came the thought everyone shared but few dared to voice aloud. What would she say in return? Would she shrink beneath the shadow of a political giant, or would she rise? Die. Answer was coming. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath, but no one expected how Crockett would respond. The room had barely recovered from the sting of Clinton's jab, yet the weight of the moment was only beginning to settle. What he had unleashed was not just a personal slight, it was a symbolic attempt to delegitimize everything Jasmine Crockett represented. In that single arrogant remark, Clinton was not merely mocking her resume, he was echoing the centuries-old pattern of powerful men dismissing women, especially women of color, who dared to challenge them in spaces they were never expected to occupy. The stakes were far bigger than two people trading words on stage. Clinton carried with him the reputation of a former president, a man whose political career had shaped decades of American history. For him, discrediting Crockett wasn't just sport, it was a way to remind the audience of his dominance, to flex the muscles of an old empire. His words landed. If they stuck, they could taint her credibility in the public's eye. That was the danger she faced. But Crockett was not just any opponent. Her legal career was not built in gilded offices or with inherited networks of influence. It was born in the trenches courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients. Neighborhoods where justice was often an afterthought. Every trial, every brief, every late night pored over case files had been part of her fight to prove that the law could serve the overlooked. For her, the courtroom had always been a battleground. And tonight, Clinton had unknowingly stepped onto her turf. The audience, too, felt the tension vibrating in the air. Some shifted in discomfort, silently, complicit with Clinton's tone. Others clenched their fists, their eyes darting toward Crockett, willing her to answer back. Social media was already buzzing, tweets and posts flying out as the confrontation spread beyond the room in real time. Did Clinton just belittle Jasmine Crockett's legal career? Clips of his smirk were already being replayed and dissected, each replay amplifying the insult. And in those whispered reactions, those hashtags already beginning to trend, lay the higher stakes. This moment was about more than Crockett's career. It was about representation, about the dignity of every immigrant child whose parents told them they could be anything, about every first-generation lawyer who carried the weight of proving they belonged. Clinton's words weren't just an attack on her, they were an attack on the idea that the American promise is real for everyone, not just the privileged few. Crockett understood this. She didn't need to look at her phone to know what was happening. She didn't need to hear the whispers, to feel the way her silence was stretching into power. Clinton had raised the stakes of the evening without realizing it. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a referendum on whose story mattered. The crowd leaned in, sensing the turning point but not knowing when it would arrive. Clinton sat back, in his chair, smug in the belief that his words had landed clean. Yet the truth was more dangerous for him. In raising the stakes against Crockett, he had raised them against himself. He had set the stage for a reckoning that would not end the way he imagined. And in that pause, in that tense quiet, the question grew louder. How far would Jasmine Crockett go to defend her name, her career, and everything she stood for? The answer would come soon, and it would shake the room. Bill Clinton had built his life on the art of control. From the earliest days of his political ascent, he carried himself like a man destined to be at the center of history. The boy from Arkansas became the governor who charmed his way into national politics. The president who commanded rooms with a grin that could melt suspicion and a voice that could spin scandal into survivable narrative. For decades, his secret weapon was charisma, a disarming mix of intelligence, a folksy warmth that made audiences feel as though he spoke directly to them. But charisma is a double-edged blade. What once drew people in eventually revealed its darker edge and arrogance that slipped through the cracks. Clinton's legacy is defined by contradictions. The man who spoke of empathy yet presided over policies that devastated communities. The president who stood before the nation insisting he felt their pain even as his own scandals dominated headlines. He was both admired and distrusted, powerful and tarnished. And it was that mixture, confidence fused with entitlement, that colored his words on stage that night. When Clinton looked at Jasmine Crockett, he did not see an equal standing on her own merits. He saw a challenger to a system he believed he had already mastered. His jab at her legal career was more than an offhand remark. It was the culmination of years spent dismissing those who hadn't walked the same corridors of privilege, those who built their reputations without the protective scaffolding of dynasty or wealth. Clinton was a man accustomed to deciding who belonged in the halls of power. In his eyes, Crockett was still an outsider trying to force her way in. The irony was sharp. Clinton himself had once been the outsider, the Southern governor mocked for his accent, underestimated on the national stage. His rise had been fueled by the very underdog energy he now attempted to deny Crockett. But power changes men, and decades of being treated as the cleverest voice in the room had hardened him. The smirk he wore as he delivered his jab wasn't just habit, it was entitlement. The smug confidence of someone who believed he could still shape the narrative with a single sentence. And yet his legacy made him vulnerable. For every tale of triumph, there was another of betrayal or failure. His presidency was shadowed by impeachment, his moral authority scarred by scandal. While he once embodied the energy of a new generation, tonight he stood as the aging face of an old guard. His attacks a reminder that he had as much to protect as Crockett had to prove. The crowd sensed this contradiction, even if they couldn't fully articulate it. The whispers that rippled after his remark weren't only about Crockett, they were about him. The audience was remembering, consciously or not, the weight of his past, the fragility of his reputation. Every smirk, every jab carried the risk of reopening wounds that had never fully healed. To Crockett supporters, the attack confirmed everything they already suspected. The establishment never lets go easily. Clinton symbolized an era of politics that tolerated arrogance as long as it came packaged in charisma. And here he was again, attempting to reduce a woman's achievements with a single smirk. He wasn't just Clinton the man anymore, he was Clinton the archetype, the embodiment of old power clutching its grip on relevance. In truth, Clinton underestimated the moment. He believed this stage would mirror those he had dominated in the past, where his voice set the tone and his charm softened the edges. But times had changed. Audiences were sharper, social media quicker, and challengers like Crockett hungrier. What once could be dismissed as just politics was now dissected, amplified, and replayed in viral loops. Every eyebrow raise, every half smile carried consequences he could no longer control, and so, When Clinton struck at Crockett, he was also striking at his own reflection, the image of a man who had once been underestimated, who had fought his way into legitimacy, now transformed into the very gatekeeper he once opposed. That contradiction made the insult sting deeper, and it made the anticipation of Crockett's reply all the more electrifying. Because the audience knew, deep down, that the tide of history runs against arrogance. And Clinton, no matter how powerful his legacy was, standing on the wrong side of it, the stage was set. His words had drawn the battle lines. But he hadn't accounted for what would happen when Jasmine Crockett stepped forward to answer the demand. In that miscalculation lay the seeds of his undoing. Long before the cameras, before the microphones, and bright lights of politics, Jasmine Crockett's story began in quiet determination. She was not born into dynasties or protected by the soft landing of privilege. Her journey was carved the hard way through late nights bent over case law, through battles in cramped courtrooms where the stakes were life-changing for people who could barely afford legal defense, where Clinton's career had been adorned with polished stages and cushioned by power. Crockett's had been tempered in the fire of service. She chose law not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. In neighborhoods where the system seemed tilted against ordinary people, she found herself representing clients who had no one else. Her victories weren't always grand, but they were deeply human. A mother keeping custody of her child, a young man given a second chance instead of a lifetime behind bars, a family able to stay in their home against predatory landlords. Each case added weight to her name, not in prestige, but in credibility, the kind that couldn't be bought or spun. Crockett's identity as a black woman in law was itself an act of resistance. Walking into courtrooms, she often carried the unspoken skepticism of those who doubted her before she even opened her mouth. She knew the whispers, the dismissive glances, the coded questions about her experience. Yet every time she spoke, every time she laid out an argument, that doubt dissolved into respect. She didn't ask for permission to be taken seriously. She forced it, and in this, her story became more than personal. She came to embody the quiet hope of countless others who had been told they were not enough. Immigrant families raising their first lawyer daughter. Young men of color told the system would chew them up. Women who had been underestimated in every boardroom and classroom, they all saw in Crockett someone who understood. Someone who refused to shrink. Her transition from courtroom to Congress was never inevitable, but it was always logical. The same fire that drove her to fight for individual clients now pushed her to fight systemic battles. She knew the law. She knew the human faces behind the law. And she knew that without voices like hers in the halls of power, entire communities would remain unheard. And so, when Clinton leaned into the microphone to question her legal career, he wasn't just misrepresenting her resume, he was erasing the stories of the people she had defended. His words tried to paint her as insignificant, but her life had been the opposite, an ongoing defiance of insignificance. Every client she had fought for, every uphill case she had taken, was proof that she had already faced battles far more intimidating than a former president's smirk. The irony was sharp. Clinton had once marketed himself as a champion of the forgotten. Crockett had lived that role. She had walked into spaces where the forgotten sat in silence, and she had spoken for them. She had not done it for applause or power. She had done it because it was the only way forward. That authenticity, that raw alignment between values and action, gave her a foundation no insult could topple. Her colleagues in Congress often remarked on her fierceness, her refusal to back down even when the odds were stacked against her. But what made her different was that her fierceness was not performative. It was survival. It was the instinct of someone who had had to fight for credibility in every room she entered, who had learned early that dignity was not given, it was defended. That night on stage, Crockett's calm silence was not the silence of someone unprepared. It was the silence of someone who had been here before, in 1,000 forms, 1,000 rooms. The smirk of a man in power was nothing new. The underestimation, the condescension, the dismissal, she had seen it all. What Clinton thought was an insult was, in truth, a spark. He had ignited the very fire she carried with her every day. the fire that came from years of being told she wasn't enough, and proving every single time that she was more than enough. 4. The audience, her story mattered because it was not just hers. It was their story too. They saw in her the validation that they had been denied, the reminder that the system could be bent back toward justice by those willing to stand tall. Her very presence on that stage was proof of resilience, of the American promise reborn through struggle, of the idea that dignity and grit still mattered more than entitlement and legacy. And as the tension in the room tightened, as Clinton sat back smugly believing he had scored a clever blow, those who knew Crockett's story leaned forward with anticipation. They knew the strength she carried, the storms she had weathered, the sharpness of her mind honed by years of real battles. They knew Clinton had underestimated her, just as so many had before him. The stage was set for her to do what she had always done, transform dismissal into defiance, arrogance into accountability, and as the crowd held its collective breath, they sensed what was coming. Jasmine Crockett was about to rise. And when she did, history would remember. The silence that followed Clinton's jab was thick enough to cut. He leaned back with the practiced ease of a man who thought he had just landed the winning blow, his lips curling into that familiar smirk, as though the matter was already settled. For a moment, he basked in the quiet, mistaking it for submission. Rather than suspense, the crowd's eyes weren't fixed on him anymore. They were locked on Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't broken her composure. Instead, she sat poised, her stillness radiating a quiet defiance. So anyone who had followed her career, that stillness was dangerous. It was the same unshakable calm she carried into courtrooms where judges doubted her, the same composure she wore when opposing counsel underestimated her. Crockett knew that silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the strike. Sensing the attention slipping away, Clinton leaned forward again, his voice heavier, sharper. "Credentials matter," he continued, waving a dismissive hand in her direction. "We can't just hand influence to people who haven't proven they can carry the weight of leadership." The words dripped with arrogance. He wasn't critiquing policy or debating ideas. He was reducing her to nothing more than a resume line he believed she hadn't earned. The implication was unmistakable. She didn't belong. She hadn't proven herself, and the audience should doubt her very legitimacy. A murmur rippled through the room. Some gasped openly this time. Others exchanged disbelieving looks. The stakes had risen, and everyone knew it. Clinton wasn't just doubling down. He was digging a trench, making it clear that his attack wasn't a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate attempt to diminish her. And yet, Crockett remained motionless. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of steadiness and restrained fire. That restraint only heightened the tension. The more Clinton pressed, the more obvious it became that he was rattling himself, not her. He tried again, pushing harder. "Experience isn't just about time in a courtroom," he said, his voice straining with insistence. "It's about shaping history, making decisions that last." The arrogance in his tone made it clear he was elevating his own record while dismissing hers, erecting a wall between the so-called greats of yesterday and the rising leaders of today, but the wall was already cracking. The audience shifted, leaning forward in anticipation. They could see it the faintest glimmer in Crockett's eyes, a barely perceptible shift in her posture as she inhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. The silence that stretched out wasn't weakness. It was a gathering storm. Clinton, oblivious, pressed once more, trying to fill the space with his authority. "And that," he said with finality, "is the difference between claiming a career and truly building one." He leaned back, satisfied, convinced that he had closed the book on her, but the audience knew better. They could feel it, as though the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Crockett's silence wasn't an end. It was the opening of something far greater. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync to the same rhythm, waiting, expecting, hungry for the response they knew was coming. And as Crockett finally straightened in her chair, as her lips parted to speak at last, the auditorium went still. Clinton's smirk remained, but it trembled at the edges. It's betrayed by the creeping awareness that he had awakened, something he couldn't control. The storm was ready to break. What came next would leave him, everyone watching stunned. The room was silent, so silent that the faint hum of the lights overhead seemed louder than the murmurs that had rippled just moments before. Clinton leaned back, smug and self-satisfied, convinced he had cemented the narrative. But then Jasmine Crockett moved. She straightened her posture, shoulders, her gaze never leaving him. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. And the crowd knew in that instant that something monumental was about to happen. Her voice broke the silence with the kind of clarity that demanded attention, low but cutting, steady but rising with each phrase.
Mr. President, she began, the honorific, almost ironic in its measured politeness. I know you've spent
decades shaping narratives. But here's the difference between USU were handed stages like this. I had to fight for every room I've ever been allowed to stand in. The crowd stirred, some leaning in, others already nodding. Litton shifted. A flicker of unease passing through his smirk. Crockett continued, her words gaining strength. You mock my career, but my career wasn't built on charm or headlines. It was built in courtrooms where no cameras rolled, where families clung to hope that anyone would fight for them. It was built defending people this country often forgets, people who don't get the luxury of power smoothing out their mistakes. A ripple of applause broke through the audience, brief but fierce, before dying into the silence that followed. Clinton's eyes narrowed. She didn't flinch. You talk about carrying the weight of leadership. Well, I've carried the weight of mothers begging for justice for their children. I've carried the weight of young men branded as criminals before they ever had a chance. I've carried the weight of communities that were never supposed to have a voice, and yet here I am, carrying them with me into this very room. The words landed like blows, not shouted but delivered with precision, each one dismantling Clinton's arrogance piece by piece. The crowd was hanging on every syllable, breathless. Clinton tried to interject, raising a hand as if to cut her off. Ash! But Crockett didn't give him the chance. Her tone sharpened, her rhythm unbreakable. You question? Whether I've built something real? Let's talk about real. Real is working late nights with no assurance the system will be fair. Real is standing in front of judges who doubt your very presence, and still winning because the truth is louder than their prejudice. Real is building credibility not because of your last name, but in spite of it. Gasps broke out across the auditorium. The tension had shifted. Clinton's smirk was gone now, replaced by tightness around his jaw. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her words softening but striking deeper for it. And here's the truth. Mr. President, I don't need to remind this audience of your scandals. They already know. What they don't always see is that for every arrogant smirk you flash, there are millions of people out there who will never forget what dignity looks like. That's what I carry. That's what I built. The applause came heavier this time, swelling into cheers that Clinton couldn't wave away. The audience was no longer neutral. They were shifting. Pulled into Crockett's orbit, she paused, allowing the noise to swell, then quieted it with her next line. You see, you can question my career all you want. You can doubt me, dismiss me, even try to humiliate me. But I'll tell you what you can't do. You can't erase my record. You can't erase the families I've helped, the lives I've defended, the communities I've stood up for. My work is written in the lives of people who still stand because I refuse to let them fall. The force of her words settled like a wave crashing over the room. Clinton looked unsettled now, eyes darting, lips pressed tight. He had walked onto that stage expecting dominance. Instead, he had triggered the most powerful moment of the night, and it wasn't his. And then came the finishing blow, the line that cut through not just Clinton, but the entire establishment he represented. Crockett tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering into the kind of tone that audiences remember forever. So when you question my legal career, remember this. My career isn't defined by titles or scandals, it's defined by service. And service will always outlast arrogance. The auditorium erupted. Gasps turned into thunderous applause, applause into standing ovations. People were shouting, clapping, some even pounding the backs of chairs. Clinton's face drained of its earlier smugness, his attempt at composure faltering as he forced a tight, uncomfortable smile. Cameras captured everything, the electricity in the room. The sheer force of Crockett's delivery, the humiliation etched across Clinton's face. Clips of her clapback were already being uploaded, the hashtags already forming, the moment already immortalized. Yet for those in the room, what lingered most wasn't the humiliation of Clinton, but the elevation of Crockett. She had taken an insult meant to diminish her and turned it into an anthem for everyone who had ever been underestimated. The ovation rolled on. And when it finally began to settle, Crockett leaned back, calm once again, her eyes fixed on Clinton as if to say, "This is what happens when arrogance underestimates dignity." The room was alive, the air electric. And though the clash itself had ended, its shockwaves were only beginning to spread, because the world beyond that room had just witnessed a transformation, and the ripple effect was about to explode the moment Jasmine Crockett's words left her lips. The reaction inside the auditorium was only the beginning. The eruption of applause, the rising chants, the visible shift in energy, it all bled out of that room and into a nation already simmering with tension. Within minutes, clips of her clapback were ripped, edited, and uploaded across every social media platform. On Twitter, no on X. Where voices collide in raw immediacy, the hashtag Crockett clapback shot to the top of trending within the hour. Journalists scrambled to describe what had just unfolded, but no headline could quite capture the electricity of that moment. Bill Clinton versus Jasmine Crockett didn't tell the story. What told the story were the millions of people watching. The clip, shaking their heads at Clinton's arrogance, then cheering when Crockett dismantled him word by word. "THIS is how you stand up to power." One post read, garnering 500,000 likes in a matter of hours. Another, from a young law student, said, "She didn't just defend herself, she defended all of us who've ever been told we're not enough." The replies flooded in, stories of immigrants, first-generation professionals, and young women of color who had fought their way through the very same dismissals, the same skepticism, the same arrogance Crockett had just faced down. TikTok exploded. Edits layered her words over swelling music, slow-motion cuts of the moment she leaned forward to deliver her closing line. Teenagers who had never sat through a political debate before were sharing clips of Crockett, captioned with lines like, "This is history." One viral video stitched together, Clinton's smirk dissolving in real time with Crockett's composure, adding text that read simply, "Dignity beats arrogance every time." Late-night comedians couldn't resist either. By the next evening, monologues were already opening with lines like, "Bill Clinton thought he was going to lecture Jasmine Crockett on law. Instead, he got a masterclass on humility." The laughter in studios mirrored the laughter online, sharp, cathartic, triumphant. But the most powerful reactions weren't jokes, they were testimonials. A civil rights activist tweeted, "In one moment, Crockett reminded us why we keep fighting. Not because we're guaranteed to win, but because dignity demands we try." The post spread like wildfire, screenshotted and reposted across Instagram stories, echoing in the words of people who had never even heard Crockett's name before. This night, cable news ran the clip in a loop. Pundits debated the significance. Was this a passing viral moment, or the crystallization of a generational shift in American politics? Some tried to downplay it, to spin Clinton's jab as politics as usual. But the visuals told the truth. Clinton looked shaken, diminished. Crockett looked steady, powerful, unbreakable. Viewers didn't need pundits to explain it. The contrast was undeniable. And then came the endorsements, not official ones, but cultural ones. Prominent authors, actors, and musicians began tweeting her lines verbatim. A Grammy-winning singer posted on Instagram, "Service outlasts arrogance." Let that sink in. Her millions of followers amplified it instantly. Communities that rarely intersect politically found themselves united. Immigrant rights groups shared the clip alongside captions about perseverance. Women's organizations hailed it as a landmark feminist moment. Even college debate teams started circulating it as an example of composure under fire. The ripple effect reached classrooms, barbershops, church basements. People were talking not just about Clinton being humbled, but about what Crockett represented. The rise of leaders who carried themselves not with entitlement, but with service. Meanwhile, Clinton's camp tried to recover. A spokesperson issued a statement the next day, claiming his comments were taken out of context and insisting he meant no disrespect. But the damage was done. The internet doesn't wait for clarifications, crowns its victors instantly. In this clash, the crown had gone to Jasmine Crockett, and what stung the most for Clinton wasn't just the criticism, it was the memes. One in particular spread relentlessly. A side-by-side of Clinton smirking before the jab, and then his frozen expression during Crockett's retort. The caption read, "Confidence gives regret. 30 seconds apart." It was brutal, it was viral, and it was unforgettable. For Crockett, though, the moment wasn't about internet points, it was about validation. She hadn't just defended her legal career, she had turned it into a rallying cry. And in doing so, she had ignited something. Larger than the room she stood in, as one commentator on MSNBC put it, Clinton thought he was playing a game of status. Crockett turned it into a referendum on dignity, and America chose. The momentum was undeniable. The shockwaves weren't just reverberating through media cycles, they were reshaping conversations in living rooms, reshaping imaginations about who could stand toe-to-toe with power and win. And as the world watched, the hashtags climb higher, as the clips shattered view counts in the millions. One question loomed larger and larger. If Jasmine Crockett could dismantle Clinton in one moment of courage, what else was she capable of doing? In the days that followed, the noise of social media, the chatter of pundits, and the relentless loop of clips gave way to something deeper, reflection. What had the country just witnessed? At first glance, it was a clash of personalities. Clinton, the seasoned statesman with decades of power behind him, and Crockett, the rising voice, unafraid to challenge authority. But beneath the headlines and hashtags, something more profound had taken root. Jasmine Crockett's clapback wasn't just about defending her resume or her right to practice law. It was about rewriting the script that so many Americans had grown tired of watching. The script where arrogance steamrolls dignity, where experience is used not as wisdom, but as a weapon to silence the next generation. She refused that script, and in doing so, she handed the audience and the nation a new one. In that moment, she reminded us of something we often forget. Dignity is not granted by titles or legacies. It is carried within us. Crockett carried it with every measured pause, with every word that cut through the noise. And by refusing to lower herself to arrogance, she showed that dignity has a strength arrogance can never touch. Her words echoed in unexpected places. A young woman, the daughter of immigrants, posted, "When Crockett stood tall, I saw my mother's sacrifices. I saw my own struggles in law school. I saw us." Another, a middle-aged factory worker, wrote, "I've been told my whole life I wasn't good enough because I didn't come from money." Tonight, she proved that doesn't matter. These weren't political endorsements. They were declarations of identity, of belonging, of pride, and that was the true victory. Clinton's jab might have been intended to belittle one woman's career, but Crockett transformed it into a universal truth. Your worth is not measured by the approval of the powerful. Your worth is measured by the service you give, by the resilience you embody, by the courage you summon when someone tries to strip it away. It was a reminder America desperately needed, at a time when politics feels like a theater of insults. Where loudness often masquerades as strength, Crockett demonstrated something radical: composure. She didn't scream, she didn't sneer. She stood in dignity, and that dignity reverberated louder than any insult could. And in doing so, she unlocked a larger story, one that extends beyond herself. She became a mirror for a generation of Americans who have been underestimated, overlooked, or outright dismissed. She became proof that the fight is not about crushing your opponent. It's about holding your ground so firmly that your opponent cannot shake you. This is why the moment mattered. Because in the clash between arrogance and dignity, America saw its own reflection. and many didn't like what Clinton's arrogance revealed. But they loved what Crockett's dignity inspired, as one columnist wrote. She reminded us that the arc of American identity bends not toward the entitled, but toward those who earn respect by serving others. That line spread almost as fast as the viral clip itself, because it rang true in the marrow of a country weary of arrogance, but hungry for authenticity. And so, confrontation was more than a debate exchange. It was a parable. It carried the same moral weight as those timeless stories we tell to our children, the mighty brought low by their own pride, the underestimated rising through courage and truth. Crockett's words became not just a rebuttal, but a lesson. They whispered across living rooms and classrooms. Dignity is our inheritance. Arrogance is a mask. Choose wisely. And perhaps the most stunning part of it all, Clinton had come to the stage expecting to put Crockett in her place. Instead, she had put America in its place, reminding us what leadership should look like, what strength really means, what service demands. But as the cheers quieted and the hashtags began to plateau, one lingering question refused to fade. Dignity had won this round so decisively. Could it win the battles yet to come? Could Crockett's moment spark not just applause, but a movement? The world was waiting for the answer. And so, the story circles back to where it began, a smirk, a jab, and an attempt to diminish. But what unfolded was more than a clash of egos, it was a revelation. Bill Clinton may have walked onto that stage with decades of power in his pocket, but Jasmine Crockett walked away carrying something far more enduring, the nation's respect. Her clapback wasn't scripted for applause, and it wasn't designed for headlines. It was an instinct born of struggle, a voice sharpened by years, of proving herself in a world that often doubted her. In those minutes, she gave millions of people permission to believe again, in dignity over arrogance, in truth over theatrics, in the idea that composure can conquer even the sharpest insult. This wasn't just her moment. It was ours. It was a reminder that every one of us has the power to stand tall in the face of dismissal, to turn arrogance into our stage, and to transform attempted humiliation into our triumph. Crockett's story doesn't end here, and neither does ours, because now it's your turn. Your turn to carry the lesson forward. Your turn to show that dignity, resilience, and pride in who you are can't be taken away by anyone, no matter how powerful they appear. If this story lit a fire in you, don't let it burn out. Share it. Subscribe to stay part of this movement. Add your voice to the millions who are tired of arrogance and ready to stand for dignity. Together, we are more than spectators. We are the story. And if Crockett proved anything tonight, it's this. The final word never belongs to arrogance. It belongs to those who stand, who endure, and who refuse to bow.